Hello, everyone. In this lecture, we're going to discuss selected material from Chapter 11 of your text. In this chapter, we focus on language. First, we'll take a look at what language is. In general, we say it's a system of communication that uses sounds or symbols. And we use language, of course, to express feelings and thoughts, as well as our experiences and ideas. Now, if we look at the creativity of human language, there is a hierarchical system that's used. We have components that can be combined to form larger units in our language, and also our language is governed by rules, so specific ways in which components can be arranged. Now, you can think about this in terms of the order of different words within a sentence. So you can think about this like what comes first, a noun or a verb. Basic rules of language that we all follow, and that will change, of course, across cultures depending on where you are. Those rules will vary. And we can say that language is quite universal in that, for example, deaf children invent sign language that's all their own just to use a way of communication. Also, all humans with normal capacities develop language and learn to follow its basic rules and complex rules. And also, language is universal across all cultures. Again, the specifics within the language, given the culture, will change, of course, but language will always be present in some way. That is, there's always some way of communication, given whatever culture you're in. Also, language development is similar across cultures, meaning that depending on how old a child is, the development and communication will be similar across cultures. And we also say that languages, they're very unique, of course, but the same in the same way. Now, what we mean is that, of course, different languages, they're going to have different words, different sounds, and different rules. But they all have nouns, verbs, negatives, and also ways to ask questions and past and present tense. So while all languages have a lot of components that are different in terms of words and sounds, they also have a lot of similarities in terms of the types of words that are used and the types of tenses that are used. Now, if we look at studying language in terms of cognitive psychology, so basically, how is language learned? Now, B.F. Skinner, we talked about him specifically in the first chapter. He really thought that language was learned just through reinforcement. So a child would produce some speech and would be reinforced for that. So that then makes that child more likely to produce speech in the future. However, Noam Chomsky argued that there must be some sort of biological component to language, meaning that children will produce sentences and language that they've not ever heard before, and they haven't obviously been reinforced for doing that. So there must be some underlying biological mechanism by way of children developing language. Now, of course, again, here are two sides of the debate. I could argue either one. So it's just a matter of whatever makes more sense to you. Now, if we look at psycholinguistics, this is an area of study that really is looking at the psychological process by which humans acquire and process language. And this particular area looks at comprehension as well as speech production, representation, and acquisition of speech. Now, if we think about how we perceive and understand words, if we're looking at a specific person, we could say that each person has a lexicon, which consists of all words that that person understands. And if we look more specifically at words, we can divide them up into even shorter segments of speech. So first would be phonemes. This is the shortest segment of speech that, if changed, changes the meaning of a word. A morpheme is the smallest unit of language that has meaning or grammatical function on its own. And here we take a look at an interesting effect that we probably experience quite a lot. This is called the phonemic restoration effect. So this basically occurs when we kind of get interrupted when we're listening to speech, and essentially we fill in what's missing. So the missing phoneme, we fill it in based on the context of the sentence as a whole and the portion of the word that's actually presented. So this particular person here is listening to this portion of a sentence, but there's a cough sound that occurs right here. So this portion is kind of covered up by this cough sound, but he just fills it in based off of the context of the rest of the sentence. Now, I would argue that this is largely, most of the time, probably a very unconscious thing. We don't even realize we do with this, but it is an effect nonetheless, and quite an interesting one. How we're able to fill in um, missing sections or phonemes just based off of context alone. Now we'll look at speech segmentation here, and speech segmentation is kind of interesting, and it's something that we don't really, again, realize that we do. Now, you will realize this if you listen to a language that you don't understand. It sounds like all the words are just running together. You can't separate the words from each other. It just sounds like a garbled mess. Now, our speech sounds very much the same if we're a native English speaker and we're listening to other English speakers. The way I'm speaking to you right now sounds like all the words are running together, but you have a lot of experience with the English language. So you're very able to separate all of my words to understand what each word is. And you're doing that based off of a few different things. First of which is context of what I'm talking about, but also understanding the meaning of the words I'm using, understanding sound and syntactic rules, but also statistical learning. So you can kind of think about that as being how common words are used and things like that. So just based off commonality of words used, making more sense of what I'm saying. So basically, when you think about speech segmentation, you want to think about the ability to tease apart speech word by word by word. Now here we look at the word superiority effect. So this here is just suggesting that people do better at recognizing letters when they're contained within an actual word rather than just kind of a garbled bunch of letters or a non-word. So in this particular example, a person would do better in this condition than in this condition. Now, again, we can say that this is largely based off of experience, of course, but also context as well. Now, if we look at ways in which we can take a look at how we understand words, there are a few things that we can do. We can look at lexical decision tests. So this is when we have participants read a list of words and non-words silently, and we have them say yes when they read a word, a real word. Also, we can look at the word frequency effect. So this is basically when we see participants responding more rapidly to high frequency words or words that are occurring more often or are more common than more rare words. We can also look at eye movements while reading. Now, what we find here is that participants will look longer at low frequency or more rare words rather than high frequency words. Now we look at lexical ambiguity. Now, we've seen this quite a bit in our language, basically where we have words that have more than one meaning. And if you've ever studied for the SAT or ACT or the GRE for graduate school, then you know the whole verbal portion of that test is really heavily steeped in words that have more than one meaning. Now, this can be cleared up most of the time if the word is in a context and not a standalone. So if we have the word and it's placed within a sentence or within a story, we can use the context that it's in to kind of clear up the ambiguity and decide which meaning of the word is the proper one given the context that it's used in. And now, kind of similarly, we look at meaning dominance. Now, this is focusing on the idea that some words are used more frequency than others. So basically using the more likely definition of the word. Now, I think we tend to do that a lot in our language. Some words do have multiple definitions, but we very quickly will gravitate toward the most common definition of the word. Now, we also do have bias dominance, and this is when words have two or more meanings with different dominance. Now, again, that would be having two meanings. One has higher dominance than the other meaning. Now, in that case, then we're going to go with the more likely of the two meanings, meaning that the one that is more dominant. Now, we also have balanced dominance. I think this is a bit more rare, but this is when words have two or more meanings that are essentially about equal in terms of dominance, meaning it's basically equally likely that the word will mean any of those meanings. Now, something that we can note is that components of language are not processed in isolation. Again, this is the whole contextual idea. Now, if we focus on how we understand sentences, we do this in two different ways. We focus on two different things. First of which is semantics, so the actual meanings of the words and sentences that are being used. And then we look at the syntax. So this is the rules for combining words into sentences. So we use both semantics and syntax in order to understand sentences that we see. Now, if we look at brain imaging studies and things like this, when someone is actually trying to process or understand a sentence, and they're going through the semantics and the syntax within the sentence, what we're finding with brain imaging is that syntax and semantics are associated with different mechanisms. So depending on what a person is focusing on, different areas of the brain are being activated. So the syntax and semantic processes aren't going on in the same area of the brain. Now, if we're focusing on sentences, sometimes we'll have sentences that will, as we're reading them, they read a certain way and we think that the meaning is going to be this certain meaning, but once we finish the sentence, it turns out that the sentence is meaning something totally different. These type of sentences are called garden path sentences. So the sentence is kind of leading you along down one path, but the very ending of the sentence kind of drops off and takes you down another path. So the meaning of the sentence changes kind of abruptly. Kind of similar is temporary ambiguity. So we have initial words in the sentence that seem ambiguous, but the end meaning of the sentence by the time we finish the sentence makes everything clear. So it kind of clears up what the initial words actually meant. So kind of similar to garden path, but different in that in temporary ambiguity, we're focusing on the initial words being ambiguous rather than the sentence just seeming to mean one thing, but then it turns out to mean something else. Now, if we focus on parsing now, this is where we're actually taking different words and things like this out of a sentence and actually grouping them together. Now, we can look at a syntax-first approach to parsing, so using rules, essentially. So grammatical structure, we can say, might be what's determining parsing with a sentence. Now, if we look at late closure, this is basically assuming that the parser, which would be you, for example, assumes a new word is part of a current phrase. So a new word that you might see, you assume it's part of a current phrase that you're already looking at. So you may parse that together. Now, there's also an interactionist approach to parsing. Basically, this is suggesting that both semantics and syntax both influence the processing as you read a sentence. So as you're kind of taking words out and kind of grouping them together within the sentence to make a meaning, this is suggesting that you use not only the rules of sentences and stuff like that, like syntax, but you're also using semantics or the meaning of words to do this as well. Now, we have a study that kind of focused on parsing. In this particular study, they used a visual word paradigm, and they measured eye movements and change in eye movements when information was given that suggests revision of a previous interpretation of a sentence. So, and what they found here was that it seemed as though participants were using both syntactic and semantic information simultaneously when parsing. So here we have an example of kind of the figures that were used in this particular task. So basically here we have a 2 apple versus a 1 apple condition. So here in the 2 apple condition, they told a participant, so put the apple, and there are 2 apples, keep in mind. So for example, this participant might look at this apple, but then they're saying on the towel. So we see eye movements move over here, and then finally they say in the box. So this apple goes in the box. And here again, we have the 1 apple condition here. So the suggestion here is that based off of eye movements, and particularly this condition here, so you can see participants are kind of moving their eyes back and forth. And basically what this is suggesting is that when we see this, participants are kind of going back to check themselves to make sure that they have the right meaning or that they're doing the right thing. And basically, go ahead again in your text and take a look at this particular study. But they find support that participants are using both the meaning of the words that they see to parse, but also the syntactic rules as well. So this is kind of that evidence for the latter suggestion of both syntax and semantics being used for parsing rather than just syntax alone. Now, if we look at, again, how we understand text and stories, we can really focus on coherence. And this is where we have kind of the representation of the text that you read in your mind, so that this information from one part of the text can be related to, for example, a previous part of the text or another part later in the text. So it's kind of like this idea, like if you're reading a story, and as you read, you kind of have all of this imagery going on in your mind. You kind of have a representation of what you think the story might look like or sound like, and you can kind of compare that to later portions of the story or earlier portions of the story. So basically, coherence again is just referring to how you represent text in your mind. Now, we also know that when reading, we make inference. Specifically, readers create information during reading that's not explicitly stated in the text. So we might go well beyond what the text is actually telling us. It could be to try to fill in some gaps in our understanding. It could be a totally subconscious thing. But we do tend to fill in information and basically make inferences when we're reading. Now, this could be anamorphic. So when we're using this anaphoric, we're actually connecting objects, so non-living objects, to actual people. This could be instrumental, focusing on more tools and methods, or it could be causal. So we could be inferring that events in one clause, for example, were caused by events in a previous sentence. And again, it may not be explicitly stated in the text, but we're going to make that leap because we are inferring that. Now, similarly, we'll look at a situational model. So this is mental representation of what the text is about. So quite similar to coherence. And again, this is representing events as if experiencing the situation. So this is that kind of idea that as a reader, you are representing these events almost as if you're experiencing them yourself. And typically, we do take the point of view of the protagonist or the main character of a story. We do find something quite interesting if we're looking at physiology in terms of stimulation. So if we're looking at actual body movements that we might make and comparing them to when we read about those same type of movements. So when we make actual movements versus when we read about related action words to those movements, we find approximately the same areas of the cortex of the brain are activated. So whether you're actually performing the movements or not, similar areas of the brain are being activated. Now, as one might guess, the activation is more extensive for actual movements, but nonetheless, we find basically the same areas of the cortex are being activated, whether or not you're actually performing the movements. Here we'll take a look at one of, you could argue maybe the most important way in which we use language, and that is to have conversations. That's how we communicate with one another. And if we're looking at conversations, we define that as just being two or more people that are talking together. We say that this is dynamic and rapid, meaning that it's happening very quickly and it's constantly changing. It's very dynamic. Now, when speaking to other people, we have this kind of given new contract, meaning that speakers tend to construct sentences as they go. So they include given information, so things they know, things that they've been given that are known between the two people. And then there's new information provided as well. And then new information can eventually become given information when we talk to that person in the future. And in general, we have this syntactic coordination, meaning that we're going to use similar grammatical constructions as the person we're speaking to. So meaning we're going to be more likely to speak like the person we're speaking to. We're more likely to kind of coordinate with them and use very similar language when we speak to each other. kind of focusing on that idea, we look at syntactic priming. Now, this is when we produce a specific grammatical construction when speaking to someone. And this increases the chances of the other person we're speaking to using that construction. So again, basically, when we're speaking to someone, the more times we speak to them, the more likely we are to use similar grammatic construction when we're speaking to them. So the two people are going to speak more like one another the more often they talk. Now, we do find that this reduces computational load within the conversation, basically just meaning that it makes it easier to communicate with that person. Now, lastly, we're going to take a look very quickly at the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So this is the idea that language influences how we actually think. Now, here's a study looking at this particular hypothesis. They took two different cultures that had different ways of labeling colors. So basically here you have one group or one culture that would label these as being the same, even though we can see that there is a shade difference. This one is quite, well, not quite, but slightly darker. But they're both blue. We would say blue. But this particular culture, this is the word they would use. Now, in this culture here, we have different categories. So again, these are both blue, but you see that they have different names here to represent basically the difference in shade. So we have this group or culture using the same category, and this culture here using a different category. And by the way, these were Russian categories here on the right side. Now, the finding of this particular study was that the differences in the way names were assigned to colors affected the ability that participants had to tell the difference between the colors. Basically, if participants were in the different category and they had different words or labels for all the different colors, they were able to identify the colors better. They just did better in telling the difference between the colors, and they just did better overall than the culture that used the same category. So this is again focusing on language and perhaps how it affects thought, because maybe in this particular case, with this type of example, the culture that used a different category that had all these different labels were actually better able to think through these different examples of colors and identify them. Okay, so as always, make sure to look through your chapter material for Chapter 11 very carefully, and please enjoy reading, and I'll be back with you next week.